how to choose a private school. This session is presented by Hawken School, one of our silver sponsors. In this session, you're going to learn about the factors families and parents should consider when choosing a private school for their child, discover practical steps to begin exploring private schools and ways to simplify and de-stress in the application process. This session will include time for questions and answers with the presenters. So you can go ahead and type your answers into the chat area, and we'll address those questions at the end. I'm Brad Mitchell, publisher of Northeast Ohio Parent Magazine. With us today, the presenters are Brooke Marcy, who's Assistant Director of Early Childhood at Hawken School, and Kathy O'Neill, Assistant Head of the School for Enrollment. So I'll hand it over to Kathy and Brooke, who'll take you on the journey of how to choose a private school.
Great, thank you, Brad. Thank you. And good morning, everyone. And I hope you're going to enjoy a cup of coffee over this conversation on how to choose a private school. We're going to jump right into it. And I thought first we would cover kind of what the agenda is going to be, so you have a sense of what we're going to talk about this morning. First, I'm going to just give you a little bit about my background. I'm going to talk about what some of the assumptions that we make in this presentation. I'm going to talk to you about why families choose a private school or consider a private school education for their children. I'm also going to talk about 10 private school considerations. And these are really based on my experience over the last 25 years in working with families who are considering independent schools and private schools. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to approach the admission process. And again, the hope is that this de-stresses the application process for you. And we're going to really focus on those things that you should proactively do in the application process. And then we're going to leave some time at the end for some questions and answers, for a question and answer session. But I would encourage you, my colleague Brooke Marcy is going to manage the chat feature for us. So as I'm going through the presentation, if you have questions to ensure that you don't forget them, if you want to just type those in the chat feature, we will certainly, I'm going to try to get through the presentation and then we'll have time to answer those questions. And certainly you can ask additional questions towards the end of the presentation. So really quickly about my background. I am from Seattle, Washington. I moved to Cleveland. This is going into my third year at Hawken School and in Cleveland. I'm also an alum of an independent school. All of my elementary school, I went to Catholic school, and I graduated from an all-girls independent school in Seattle. I'm a mother of 3 children, and between my 3 children, every one of my children was different from the other. Between the 3 of them, they attended public school, a charter school, Catholic schools, and independent schools. And I have 1 child with significant special needs. And so I only really enjoyed 1 year where 2 of my children went to the same school. So some of what the advice that I give also comes from my experience as a parent and a parent of children who have attended various schools. I've worked in independent schools for more than 25 years now. My oldest daughter is going to be 26 next month. And I started working in independent schools right out of college a year before I had her. So I've done everything from teaching, taught a 4th grade class. I was a PE teacher for 5 years, worked as the assistant to a head of school, and have probably for the last 18 years worked in administration at independent schools. This is my third year, as I said, in Cleveland and at Hawken School. I really came to Cleveland for Hawken. When I worked at independent schools in Seattle, we oftentimes would send faculty and staff to visit Hawken to really take a look and see all of the innovative things they were doing. And so I was very familiar with Hawken. So when this position became available, I knew that Hawken and Cleveland was going to be a good fit for me. Currently, I serve on 2 National Association boards. So I serve on the Educational Records Bureau and the Association of Independent Schools Admission Professionals Association. Again, both are national associations, so they serve folks from all over the country. So that also gives me kind of a national lens at private schools as well. And currently, as Brad said, I'm the Assistant Head of School for Enrollment Management at Hawken School. If you're familiar with Hawken, Hawken is an independent day school, co-educational day school, just over 100 years old. We have 4 campuses, 2 preschool through 8th grade campuses, 1 on the west side called the Birchwood School of Hawken. We have another preschool through 8th grade campus in Lyndhurst, so on the east side. And then we have our upper school, which serves high school grades 9 through 12. That's in Gates Mills. And just new this fall, we just opened the Mastery School of Hawken in the University Circle area. And we serve a total enrollment of 1,450. I manage a team of 12 admission professionals. I oversee enrollment, admission, and our flexible tuition or our financial aid program on all 4 of our campuses. So that just gives you a little bit about my background. The assumptions that I'm making when kind of putting this presentation together for you is that we're going to be focusing on looking at independent school or private schools for early childhood through high school, so grade 12. Again, much of the advice I give is based on my comprehensive experience with private schools over the past 25 years. There are many kinds of private schools, but keep in mind that private schools, there's 2 things that we have in common, all private schools. We are tuition charging, and we have an application process. But other than that, you can have certainly religious schools, non-sectarian schools, you can have single gender schools, you can have co-educational schools, you can have for-profit schools and non-profit private schools. So there are lots of private schools. So what I'm going to be talking about today is just general overarching themes. But again, the schools I'm referring to when I say private schools are those who are tuition charging and who have an application process. And then finally, you probably know this because you're here listening to this presentation, really considering and being thoughtful about considering private school requires really an investment of time at the bare minimum. You just kind of have to take the time to really understand the needs of your child educationally, but also take the time to explore the various school options that you have. Why a private school? So in my experience working with families, again, over the last 18 years in administration and specifically working in admission, I found the #1 reason why people consider private school is because they want an excellent education for their kids. Typically, it's because they want their children to go on to higher education and they want to have a solid foundation to prepare their children really for college, but even beyond college for life, okay? They also typically, families who are looking at private school want a nurturing and supportive environment. Oftentimes when you ask families who are at private schools or alums of private schools, oftentimes they talk about the community that they had at their private school. It's usually close-knit, warm, supportive, welcoming, and that's usually an important component of looking at an independent school or a private school. Again, they want a school that helps to develop their child's social and emotional intelligence. So private schools oftentimes spend a lot of time, and we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of social emotional learning at private schools. Oftentimes, private schools are small. They have small class sizes. The student to teacher ratio is typically small. And so teachers really do get to know their students. And that's certainly a value add of private schools. Oftentimes, private schools they strive to instill in their students the love of learning. And finally, families who really are considering private schools want the opportunity for their children to grow, not just in the classroom, but they really want opportunities for their children outside of the classroom. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the co-curricular programs oftentimes that are offered at private schools. That really offer kids great opportunities to explore something new, to discover new talents and passions. And it really is, most private schools want students to get involved in those co-curricular programs. So we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about what families typically consider when choosing a private school. And again, based on my work with families, over the last 25 years, these are common reasons why families consider a private school for their children's education. Keep in mind that this is not an exhaustive list. As you kind of look and explore and think about what your family values around education, you may very well have other considerations. And these considerations that I offer to you today are not in any particular order, although I will say the number one consideration that most families look at, looking for at private school is for the academic program. I've never had a family say to me, it has all of these other wonderful things, but a mediocre academic program, and that's why I'm looking for private school. So typically, the number one reason for looking at a private school is because they want that solid educational foundation, and you really get that from the academic program. When I think about the academic program, some of the things that you should be thinking about when you're trying to assess a private school on their program is, how is the school accredited? So accreditation, again, how can you tell if the school is doing what it purports to do, if the school is living its mission? And oftentimes the accrediting body will tell you whether or not the school meets the standards and whether or not it is educating students at the bare minimum to the state standards at each grade level. But again, I think asking who accredits the private school is an important question to consider. You want to think about the scope and sequence of the curriculum at the private school, so you want to ask questions around that. Oftentimes you want to look at the breadth and the depth of the program or the offerings, especially as students get older and they're in middle school and high school. Remember, we're talking about a big span here. So in early childhood all the way up through 12th grade. Obviously, as your student gets older and they're in middle school and high school, you might have a student who's very interested in science. And so you'll want a program that offers student choice, where they can both learn, if they're a science kid, they can explore various aspects of science, or if they can go deep in a particular area of science. You also want to look at the quality of the faculty. I always tell families that you can have a school that has beautiful buildings and a beautiful campus, and if they have a mediocre faculty, you have a mediocre program. It really is the quality of the faculty that drives the program, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a little bit as well. Also thinking about differentiated instruction. So you probably know this, that students have different ways that they learn. And so I might be more of an auditory learner or a visual learner, or I might need to do hands-on learning to really grasp concepts. And so increasingly, teachers have to be pretty adept in differentiated instruction to ensure that all students in their classroom are learning and benefiting from the academic program. Again, most families, one of the considerations they're thinking about is the social emotional learning at a school. And when I talk about social emotional learning, we're really looking at, does the school have an intentional SEL, social emotional learning, that is integrated throughout the program? So not just in one grade level, not just when they're in early childhood, but how do they teach those social emotional skills throughout middle school and throughout high school? I think, when you think of resilience, how do we help students through failure, right? Learn through failure. When we talk about resilience, usually that's how you achieve resilience, is you have to learn how to move through failure and learn from that. You want to look for a school where teachers know their students, and you want to think about what kind of identity development does the school offer for students. So, a student who is in early childhood, oftentimes students are focusing all about me, and their whole world is all about me. And that's a part of identity development for students, and helping them to feel good about who they are, and knowing that identity changes over time. And so again, what do we do to support students as their identity changes? Maybe they see themselves as a great writer, and by the time they're in middle school, they see themselves as a really strong athlete, right? And that is completely normal. It's a totally normal part of child development, that your identity ebbs and flows and changes, and how do you embrace that? And then you're also looking for, what are the resources available when students struggle socially, emotionally? Because throughout life, we all have disappointments and setbacks, and increasingly we know that students and teenagers are suffering from depression and mental health issues. And when those things happen, a child, their dog passes away, a parent gets ill, what are the resources that the school has that are available to support those students' times? Increasingly too, private schools talk about developing the whole child. And when we talk about developing the whole child, we're thinking about these first two components. And so you're gonna see as we talk about these considerations, there's a lot of overlap between them. So when I think about developing the whole child, it takes me back to the first two considerations. So I want more than just academic preparation for my child. I want students, or I want teachers and faculty and staff that know my student, encourage my student to learn something new, to try on something new, to help them really reach their full potential. So when I think about developing the whole child, yes, you're thinking about the academic program and the social emotional learning that the student needs to engage in, but also what are all of the opportunities that the school provides for my student to find success outside of the classroom. And oftentimes that overlaps with another consideration that we're going to talk about a little bit later when we talk about co-curricular programs. You want to make sure, especially as students, even students in preschool, and I know Brooke can attest to this, student choice is important. We know that the best learning environments are ones that encourage students to be curious, and curiosity is born out of giving students choice so that they can really engage in those learning opportunities that they're most interested in. But again, we want to help our students meet their full potential, learning through failure, but really ways in which they can find success beyond. Obviously, we want them to find success in the classroom, but we also want a school that helps our students find success beyond the classroom. With private schools have a mission. Typically, they have a mission statement or their reason for existing. And usually, most independent or private schools go about they're intentionally creating a community that helps them to live their mission. So I always advise families that you should know what the mission of the private school is, and it should align itself well with the values that your family has. So you should look at private schools that have a mission that you believe in strongly. You should be asking questions around, what are the values of the school, and do those values align well with our family values around education? Does the school, in what ways does the school foster strong partnerships between home and school? Because again, the educational, it's a journey with children, right? And at some point, to best support your child, there's going to be a need for a strong partnership between you as the parents or guardians and the school. And then how do we ensure that we have a community where every child can thrive and feel included? Faculty development. Remember I said earlier that your academic program is highly dependent on your faculty. And so one of the considerations that many families consider when thinking about a private school is how does the school invest in its faculty, right? What opportunities do faculty, staff, and faculty have to continue with their professional and personal growth? That can be conferences, webinars, maybe the faculty reads a book over the summer and they have book groups. They might bring speakers in on professional development days. Some schools, they have a time where faculty reflects at the end of the year on what went well, and then they come together and they might produce a personalized plan for improvement each year. So again, continuing to invest in the development of your faculty is a critical component at most private schools. Innovation and technology in today's world is, again, usually a critical component at private schools. You want an innovative curriculum that is really going to help prepare students for jobs that don't even exist today. And so students need opportunities, and many private schools now have what are called maker spaces, places where they can build and create and be creative and support their learning in their classes. But again, you want to know if a school offers those maker spaces, what's the student's opportunity to engage in those spaces, and at what grade level do they get to engage with those spaces. Increasingly with our children, teaching digital citizenship is very important. Obviously, to having parent and partnership education. So what kinds of educational opportunities does the school provide for parents in helping their children navigate the technology that is available to them that, quite frankly, was not available to many of us as parents and guardians? How do we help our students navigate that? And especially with social media, what is age appropriate, and how can we best work together, again, the partnership between school and home, to support our students with their online participation. Diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice. I think in today's world too, we have seen this increasingly important recently, but this is something that many private schools have been striving to do for many years. Again, educational programs that represent a variety of perspectives and experiences are important for a lot of families, because they know that without that, their students are not going to be prepared for the world that they're going to move into really beyond college. So being able to work collaboratively with people that are different from themselves, what kinds of programs and supports do students offer, or do schools offer students around DEIJ? How do they approach it? How do schools define diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice? Because it's not the same. What kinds of educational opportunities and how do they engage families in issues around DEIJ? So again, looking at, and what's developmentally appropriate. So the way in which we might approach DEIJ work and issues with early childhood students is going to look very different from the way in which we engage middle school and high school students in that work. Co-curricular programs, we kind of talked about this earlier, and its overlap and importance in helping our students really meet their full potential. But again, many families, when they're thinking about private schools, they want more than just the academic program, right? And that's why they choose private schools, because oftentimes private schools offer students a variety of opportunities to engage in the arts and athletics and student clubs, outdoor education, travel programs, summer enrichment, before and after school care. All of those provide opportunities for students to develop lifelong skills, like leadership skills and working with, again, students and families that are different from themselves. But oftentimes these co-curricular programs, because it's usually something that the student chooses to engage in, it's of great interest to them, and it helps them really to enrich not just their mind and their body, but also their soul. And so co-curricular programs is something you want to ask about as you're looking and considering private schools. The accessibility of programs, I would say the biggest barrier for private schools and why families don't necessarily consider private schools is because they're tuition charging, right? And so one of the questions that many families need to ask is, can I afford, based on what the tuition is of the private school, and it went from private school to private school. So understanding what tuition is, understanding what your family's budget is and what you can afford. Many schools, because they're committed to socioeconomic diversity and having students and families that come from a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds, they provide need-based financial aid. And so asking questions are, what is the tuition? What does the tuition charge? What does a tuition include? What are the additional expenses that tuition does not include? Does financial aid, help to offset those expenses? Are there volunteer hour requirements or other requirements or required for enrollment at the school? These are all really important questions. Is there transportation included in tuition? Does lunch get included in tuition before or after school care? All of this really has to do with the accessibility of all students to the school's program. So having a sense, and there's not one size fits all. So for some schools, they have a lot of extra expenses, and that's something that you want to know going into a private school education. last but certainly not least, this is a consideration of many families. We certainly hope when you're looking at your child in the early childhood program that you're not thinking about college, that you're really thinking about what's in the best interest of your student when they're just little. Many families, certainly by the time their student is looking at middle school and at high school, ultimately, many families who consider private school education, they are thinking about the journey, their child's journey to college, and how well they're going to be prepared, both academically and socially, for college and beyond, right? So when we think about those life skills like leadership skills and resilience and the ability to work with a variety of people, those are not just skills you need in college. Those are skills, creative problem solving. Those are skills that you need in life. And many families, when they're looking at private schools, they're looking at throughout the program, how are these critical life skills taught to students. But ultimately, most families that are looking at private school want their child to have the option to go to college or university. And so oftentimes families they'll be asking questions around, what kinds of support does a school provide students? And you want to choose a school that has an experienced college office and that offers really a personalized college search process for each student. Want to ensure that school, especially if it's a high school, I would say, this is specific to high schools, that they have a wide range of college and university representatives that visit campus on an annual basis, so that your students can talk with those representatives and have a good sense of the various college options that are available to them. You also might, increasingly more and more students are considering a gap year, and what a gap year might provide a student who wants to maybe engage in a year abroad or doing community service. There's all kinds of wonderful enrichment gap year opportunities, and you'd want a college office that certainly can support students who are interested in a gap year as well. Really quickly, I want to share, because these considerations also, I did develop a handout for you that is accessible on our portal. And I want to try and share my screen so that you can see what that looks like, and that it actually includes. So Brooke, can you see that document that includes questions? So this document here will be available on our page, our portal page. So you can go and access this. It includes everything that I've talked about, the 10 considerations, but under each consideration, it also includes questions that you might consider or ask when you're considering and looking at private schools. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. Your family, you might have very different questions, and that's completely fine. This is meant to be a launching point, and to give you some food for thought in coming up with questions that you might want to consider and ask when you're looking at various private schools. So that, I would encourage you, is accessible on the portal page. Feel free to access that at your leisure. So I am going to try to go back to my presentation. Brooke, am I back at can you see?
Yes, you are.
Perfect,
yes.
Wonderful. Okay, so, and really quickly, I want to talk to you now. I want to kind of change, I want to pivot and change direction and talk a little bit about the application process. Remember, that's one of the things I said, that private schools, they are tuition charging, and they all have an application process. So you can't, unlike a public school, you can't just go register. You actually have to go through an application process. So these are just helpful hints that I typically give families, because not all of these are intuitive if you're not accustomed or familiar with the private school application process. So one of the things I would say is to approach the process with a positive attitude and an open mind. Oftentimes, I find that one of the biggest mistakes families make is they know someone that went to a private school, and so that's the only private school that they want to consider. And looking at private schools, you're in a fortunate situation where there are many wonderful options available to you. So, so you should consider what those options are, right? Based on what your family values are and what you're looking for in a private school, and the needs of your student. The other thing is to keep a positive attitude. I think that When you see tuition prices, sometimes that can, that can cause families to be discouraged. Don't be, because again, many schools offer need-based financial aid. And again, I think it can be, because there are a lot of great options, it can be overwhelming. And it can be hard to keep a positive attitude because there's so many great options. So again, I always say to families, try to keep a positive attitude and just be open to all the options that are available to your student and your family. This is something that is not intuitive to most families. So if my child is, about to start kindergarten, for example, I usually, most families don't know with private schools that you really need to consider thinking about that process a year in advance, because most admission processes happen the year before. So if I'm looking, for example, for my child to start in the fall of 21, I would start looking right now at private schools and going through that application process. So give yourself enough time to really explore your options. I think this is another kind of misunderstanding for families. It's really important to be transparent with schools about the needs of your child. And I'll give you an example. If I have a child who's dysgraphic or has really struggles with writing, and they've been diagnosed with dysgraphia, many schools have accommodations that they can completely support a student that's dysgraphic. But because I'm a parent and I'm worried that if I tell the school that my child is dysgraphic, they won't consider the application, or they won't see that they're admissible and completely smart and capable, I don't tell that to the school. And instead, my child takes an exam, and at the school, or they take the independent school entrance exam for one of the independent school processes. And on that essay, the school can clearly see that this child struggles with writing. It would be far more beneficial to your student if that was clear in the application, because if I looked at that, I would say, oh, wow, that totally explains the writing on that essay, because this student's dysgraphic, and there's plenty of accommodations that we can give to this student so that they can still find success in our program. I wouldn't think twice about that. I would only think twice about it if there was no information that the family included in the application that alerted me to the fact that this child was dysgraphic. So again, it's really important to be transparent about who your child is. Remember that you want both your family and the school to go into this educational journey with your child with their eyes wide open, knowing that they have the necessary program and resources to help your child, regardless of his or her needs, to find success in the program. And a part of starting that, and also starting that strong partnership between home and school, is being transparent during the application process. Really important that you begin the process early and meet all application deadlines. Many private schools do give priority to families who meet the application deadlines. And if you start early, it doesn't have to be an overwhelming process, because you can do a little bit of the application at a time. You can spread it out over 3 or 4 or 5 months versus trying to get everything done in a 2-week period. So I always say begin early and just do a little bit of the process at a time, but really calendar those deadlines and ensure that you meet the deadlines. For most of our private schools, there's no benefit to doing it early. So you don't need to feel like, oh, if I'm the first to get it in, does that help my child? Typically, the answer to that is no, but there is certainly an advantage if you meet those deadlines. I think this is just something that certainly helped me when me and specifically my middle school and high schooler were looking at schools. I think when your child is going into preschool or kindergarten, this is not so much of an issue, because parents are really making the decision on where their children attend school. But increasingly, as your child becomes middle school or high school, and they're looking at middle school or high school, students are making, they need to be a part of the process, because it's actually going to be their school and they're going to be there every day, right? And so I typically encourage students, my middle school and high school students and their parents, to sit down and kind of make a top 10 list. Because I know when I did this with my child, my list of priorities for her education was very different than her list. And I'll give you an example. Her list included, she wanted a good lunch program, and you'd be amazed at how important food is to middle schoolers and high schoolers. She wanted a lot of elective choices. She wanted to go where her friends were going, right? And so it was good to kind of upfront for us to make some lists so that we could have some conversation around what our family values were on education and how we, at the end of the day, were going to make the decision on where ultimately she would attend school, right? So we had to do some negotiating, right? And so I find that a really helpful process. I think it's also really helpful, and I hope that the document I just showed you helps you to kind of develop a list of possible questions to ask schools. Because I think, again, it helps to take the guesswork out of things, and it helps to kind of level the playing field so that you have a good sense of what's important for your student and family in choosing a school, and you have a good sense at the end of the process on which schools provide what, right? And which schools are going to be the best schools to meet your need. What I find oftentimes is there's not one perfect school, right? But the goal is to have a list of schools that could be for your child. I think you count the way in which you or your child feels when you're in a school. Again, increasingly as your child moves through elementary, middle, and high school, you might think a school is wonderful and you felt great there, and your child went there and has gone through the processes and been there many times, and they just, it doesn't resonate with them. I think that you have to at least acknowledge that, because again, that child is going to be in that school every day, and you as a parent are not. So it doesn't mean that your child completely makes a decision, maybe for your family. That's something that, you have to discuss ahead of time. And again, that's talking more about middle school, high school, looking for private schools if you're thinking about middle schools and high schools. But again, I think acknowledging how you feel in a school, or how you feel about your school, about a school, or how, and how your child feels about it, is something that you should at least acknowledge. And again, earlier in the presentation, I said this process really does require the investment of time. And so this last tip is you've got to do your homework. The school can't do it for you. You really need to understand your child's learning style, who your child is, their interests, their strengths and weaknesses. And oftentimes you as a parent, there's no better person than that to know that. But if you're not sure and your child is older, you should ask your child's teacher, right? Those people that are in your child's life that are teaching your child, caregivers of your child. So you, number one, understand your student and what their needs are. But you also have to do your research. And oftentimes families will start on the website, schools' websites. And I'm going to give you some resources in just a moment where you might start looking at private schools. Oftentimes you can go online and you can inquire at a school. They will send you materials. But there's opportunities, even in today's world where with COVID and the pandemic, there's often opportunities virtually even to still visit and explore schools. And there's no really shortcut for doing that. Materials alone, printed materials alone, will not give you a good sense of a school. And remember, we talked about that community feel. You really have to engage with the school, whether that's virtually or in person. You have to see students in those spaces. You have to have an opportunity to talk with faculty and staff and administration to really get to know and understand the school. So I would really encourage you to do your homework. Because again, at the end of the day, this is a huge investment, and probably huge investment, and probably one of the most important investments you'll make in your child is in their education. So some of those additional resources that I talked about, Northeast Ohio Parent, this is a link here that you can, we're going to upload this PowerPoint again to our portal so you have access to this. But they have a directory of private schools locally here in Cleveland. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. You have the CCIS schools, so the Cleveland Council of Independent Schools also has a directory of all of the schools in Cleveland that you can consider as well. The National Association of Independent Schools, another website, an association of independent schools, and that's nationally. So, if you were considering boarding schools or schools outside of Cleveland, National Association of Independent Schools is another helpful resource. And then the Catholic Diocese of Cleveland. I looked, and there's over 100 Catholic schools here in the Cleveland area. So again, that's a great resource if you're considering Catholic school education. And finally, niche is another area where you can look at some of the best ranked schools, K through 12, that are private schools in the area. So again, these are all resources where you might want to go to start to explore some of those schools. So I think we have a little bit of time. I don't know, Brooke, if we have any questions already, but certainly we have time for questions and answers. So I'll just open it up if we have any questions.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. So far, we have not gotten any questions in through the chat, so we'll give everyone a moment here to think. And I was just wondering if you do send in a question through the chat, if you could let us know what age range your child is in or what grade levels, so that when we answer that question, we can be specific to what your needs might be.
Super helpful. And I think I'm going to stop the share. So we can actually, feel free if you would like as well, if you want to turn on your cameras, feel free to do that. And feel free to unmute yourself if you want to just ask the question without putting it in a chat. We'll just leave it open for a few minutes in case anyone has questions.
Right. We have a few minutes. So while we're waiting for that, thank you again, Kathy, for a really helpful and objective overview. I think that's been very helpful for families to really understand the landscape of what they might want to look at from start to finish when they start that process of looking at private schools. I remember even my own situation where I think my oldest was like 4, and I took her to stuff that was more appropriate for age 6 and 7 open houses, but I really wanted to get a head start because your first year into it, you're really going in blind. You know, you pick up steam later by the time you get kid 2, 3, 4, 5, right? But yeah, nothing wrong with starting really early. And of course, programs like your own started at age 3, correct?
We started 18 months actually.
Oh, right.
At our Lyndhurst campus. Yeah. The other advice, Brad, I would say too, is oftentimes when families, so a program that's K-12, for example, or a program that's K-8, oftentimes when they come, they're just focused on the grade that their child's going to enter. And I think that is a short-sighted view. I think that if I'm a family and I'm looking at, say, early childhood, I think it's really important to kind of at least, even if it's a virtual parent tour, to take a look at what does middle school look like there and what does high school look like there, because oftentimes those students do stay for the duration of the program. And it gives you a good sense of like, wow, even though my child's starting in preschool, this is what they're going to have access to when they go through middle school and high school.
Right. No, that's a good point. Yeah, looking at the whole continuum is very important.
Yeah.
No doubt.
I think while we wait for a few more questions too, a thought that I had is don't hesitate to reach out to different schools. We always encourage, as Kathy has in this, go see as many schools as you possibly are able to at this point. And there's so many different ways, especially right now with being able to engage virtually. And don't hesitate to call. I spend a lot of time on the phone with parents who maybe Hawken's not the school they're looking for, but they'll sometimes start with us and they'll call and they'll ask questions. And I, myself, as well as I've always found the CCIS schools and the schools in the area to really just be eager to help families. So I'll spend time helping a family do research about what might be a better choice. So don't hesitate to reach out. And also another thought is most schools are very happy to have parents reach out to you as well. So if you would like to, reach out to a school and you would like to hear from a parent specifically within our communities about their experiences, schools are usually quite happy to facilitate that connection as well.
Terrific. Well, I'm getting the high sign from over there that we probably need to wrap up. So I really appreciate the input from both of you. Probably the best way, if you'd like to chat further with Kathy or with Brooke, there is an expo area within our platform. You can connect over there, or you can check them out at hawken.edu, of course, and learn more about Hawken in general and connect with some staff members there. So appreciate the attendees. Thank you for joining us. We've got another session starting at 11 o'clock. I'd like you to consider joining that one. That one's about managing, pardon me here, about managing virtual learning and screen time. Screen time is obviously, and it has been a premium during this COVID situation. So learn some tips from Dr. Jay Burke at 11 o'clock. So thank you again, Kathy and Brooke.
Thank you.
And
Thanks, Brooke.
thank you for participating,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.